Greetings, this is Tony Arend, and this is SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar series brings in distinguished members of the Georgetown faculty and alumni community to talk about the most critical issues of our day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. What is happening in America? Just over a month ago, insurrectionists stormed the Capitol, a building that some have called the Temple of American Democracy. Even as we speak today, a trial is going on in the Senate of the United States, if you will, in the crime scene, a trial against the former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, where he is accused of inciting the insurrection. What does this mean for us today? What does this mean for the survivability of American democracy? Well, that's a tall order, but we have an amazing guest today, Professor Elizabeth Saunders. Professor Saunders is a professor in the School of Foreign Service, a member of the core faculty of our great security studies program. She is a noted author, having focused on U.S. foreign policy, the presidency and foreign policy, and the politics of the use of force. She has written many works, including the award-winning publication entitled Leaders at War: How Presidents Shape Military Interventions. She is also the editor of a very important blog, and if you haven't looked at this blog, please do. It is the Washington Post's political science blog entitled The Monkey Cage. And perhaps even later in our conversation, Professor Saunders can help us understand what the title The Monkey Cage means. Professor Saunders did her undergraduate work at Harvard College, where she majored in physics, astronomy, and astrophysics. She has a master's degree in international...
No questions about that, please.
Say what?
No questions about physics or astrophysics today, please.
Fair enough, fair enough. We do have people that can talk about that, but we will not ask about physics and astrophysics. She has her master's from Cambridge in international relations. You can ask about that. And her PhD from Yale in political science. So without any further ado, Elizabeth, you have written pieces in the Post, in the New York Times. You had an extraordinarily well-received co-authored piece that came out in December in the New York Times about the survivability of democracy. What do you think? Where are we? How are we to understand the survivability of democracy in the United States today?
Well, first, thanks, Tony, for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I think that your question is the question of the day, quite literally, and the survivability of democracy, the jury's still out. The jury is literally across town in the Senate chamber as we speak. And I think I should also say this is really not I would never have guessed that, you know, everything you just said about my scholarship. I study war, right? What am I doing here? And as I was thinking about that question this morning, preparing for today's seminar, I was really struck by how it is that scholars of war and scholars of conflict have ended up writing on topics like the survivability of democracy. So I just thought I'd spend a minute talking about how my co-author Susan Hyde, who is an expert on international law and international election monitoring and the norm of international election monitoring, got onto the topic of the survivability of democracy at all. We spent 5 years researching an article that we published in an international relations journal where we tackled kind of an age-old question in international relations, which is, do democracies do better at international politics? Do they win the wars? Do they win wars at a higher rate? Are they more effective in making trade policy, et cetera? Are they just better players in the international game, so to speak? And there are lots and lots of arguments that they are, primarily because they have democratic accountability, and so the people are watching them make policy and they kick out the bums who don't make good policy. But recently, there's been a sort of pushback against this from scholars of autocracies who pointed out that autocracies can sometimes do pretty well in the international arena, and they can also sometimes generate accountability in other ways, maybe not at the ballot box, but maybe their elites get mad and remove autocratic leaders who are not performing well. And so in the course of doing this research, we were really aiming to get at the heart of what makes democracies distinctive. And we decided that, and what we found is that it's not even so much that they hold elections, because plenty of pseudo-democratic, as Susan calls them, countries hold elections that are kind of sham elections. It's that their institutions are resilient. They're built to withstand attacks from autocrats or temporary suspensions of democratic rights. They can usually bounce back. They can bend without breaking. And that resilience is a precious resource. And as we began to hear about what political scientists made of the Trump years, everything seemed very extreme. It was either, oh, we passed the test, everything's good, we can go back to normal, right? Or people said, well, this is permanent damage and we won't know for a while, but this is really apocalyptically terrible, right? And there was not a lot in between. And so we felt that we wrote this piece in December, before the riots, obviously, before the insurrection at the Capitol, to basically argue this isn't a pass-fail test. This is a test that we still could pass or fail. At the time, there hadn't been the storming of the Capitol, but there had been plenty of other things. Trump had denied, he refused to concede. He was attacking the integrity of the election after certifications began to come in. And so we wanted to point out that our democracy has come through this, but to quote the great political philosopher Kelly Clarkson, it's not that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It could be that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but what doesn't kill you can also leave you weakened. And we don't know yet, right? So it's really important what you do after the bending to make sure that you can snap back to your original shape and really come out of this with strong institutions. And so we didn't like the black and white pass-fail grading that people were doing. And one of the things that became very clear is that a crucial element of resilience is everybody believing that democracy is a thing worth preserving, and that policy wins, and even your own political career, or seeing if you're a voter or your favorite politician winning elections, sometimes you have to compromise on that for the sake of maintaining democracy. And what I think we've seen, and one of the most alarming things about what happened on January 6th, is that, incited by politicians, there's clearly much weaker shared agreement in the citizenry that democracy for its own sake is worth preserving. And that's, to me, kind of the thing that I'm most concerned about. I think the other thing to say is, it seems at this point that most pundits believe Trump will not be convicted in the strict sense of getting 17, getting up to 67 votes, which would require 17 Republicans to cross over and vote for conviction. But it does seem likely that a majority of the Senate will vote to convict, and I don't know whether there's currently an effort to have a censure vote or something after that. But I think the way that whatever happens from the impeachment trial is presented to the public and how everyone reacts to it will be really important, because this was a transgression against democratic norms and the rule of law. And if it goes unpunished, I was just reading some very old and arcane political science research this morning on the origins of democratic stability. And one of the things that's crucial to that is everybody agrees on what the outer bounds of acceptable behavior are for the state. And when those bounds are crossed, those transgressions are punished. And if this goes unpunished, and I don't think it has to be conviction, it could be a very strong rebuke, or framing a majority vote to convict as a very strong rebuke. But if it's not strongly worded or conveyed by a lot of politicians very loudly, that to me will mean we're not doing the work we need to do to rebuild democratic resilience.
It's troubling. And I appreciate quoting Kelly Clarkson because as I was
Every
thinking
time I
about
hear that song, I think about this problem, right? And I
well,
no, what doesn't kill you doesn't always make you stronger.
No, it doesn't. And because there's a big difference between being stronger and being dead. There's a lot of stuff in between those two points. One of the songs that's been occurring to me in all this is the Eagles' Long Run. We're scared, but we ain't shaken. Kind of bent, but we ain't breaking. And so the question is, are we breaking? And I like your reference to the idea of there needs to be some form of accountability, and the impeachment trial may provide some form of accountability. There may also be a need, and some people have suggested that there should be some kind of a commission that will look at not perhaps just the insurrection, but the insurrection, QAnon, kind of all these things. I mean, if you think about it, there was the Warren Commission after the Kennedy assassination. After 9/11, there were actually a variety of 9/11 commissions. Do you think something? So let's assume that the impeachment trial probably doesn't convict, but there's a majority against former President Trump. Do you think an additional commission of some kind could be useful, cathartic, and be able to hold individuals accountable in a way that would allow the institutions to move forward?
So this is a great question. I think that one of the things we political scientists need to do is a lot more research on building institutional trust. We have some research on what leads the sort of background conditions that lead people to trust institutions more. So times of high international threat, for example, people turn to their institutions. But how you build it when it's low or damaged is not something that we have a great handle on. And we also don't have a great handle on how you build trust in different institutions. So I think a commission on what happened at the Capitol, including all the things you mentioned, but also the clear failure of the security apparatus to anticipate, or if it did anticipate, to put the right plans in place, which may be a function in turn of wanting to hold back after what happened in Lafayette Square in June. So something that really can get at all these things would be very important and put, a set of facts out there. But if people are going to look at these facts in totally different ways through completely different lenses, then I don't know that that's a solution on its own. So I think we need to think hard about how we build trust in different kinds of institutions. And we've seen this in the pandemic. So various groups not trusting science, sometimes because of things that the president has said. Other groups that are historically distrustful of healthcare because they have good reason to. So vaccine hesitancy is not the same in all groups. And, for example, the African American community has longstanding distrust of healthcare institutions. And the solutions to those two different kinds of mistrust are going to be different. So I think that a commission can help, but I think we have a variety of different problems of mistrust that need to be addressed. And there's not going to be a silver bullet solution to that problem.
And this is a question actually suggested by former student John Gutowski. He says, how can we rebuke when we can't even agree on the facts? And it gets to your point about believing the experts, believing in science. One of our former alums from the government department, Tom Nichols, has written a recent book on the death of expertise, and sort of raises that whole question. Let me just pivot on that a moment. What role do you think educational institutions can play in trying to facilitate an appreciation of facts, of truth, of reasoning, of logic? Is there a greater role that Georgetown should play, or other educational institutions?
Well, I think educational institutions have a huge role to play because I'm part of one and you're part of one, and here we are, right? But I think the real one lesson of 2016 is that education is becoming a huge dividing line in our society, and so educational institutions can only serve the populations they serve, and so we have to think hard about what populations we are able to reach, and the pandemic has exposed this problem even more. So I think inequality is the relationship between inequality and educational divides and respect for expertise is very important. But I think the other big, I don't know if we're allowed to say the elephant in the room anymore because it's associated with, the elephant is associated with a party, but the big kind of elephant in the room, stuffed animal in the room, whatever you want to call it, is polarization. So in some other work that research that I've done with a scholar at Temple University, Alexander Geisinger, who's an expert on trade policy, we got really interested in whether, I study war, she studies trade, is the way people think about expertise different in those two areas? Mm-hmm. People just trust experts in the war and security arena more than they trust people to say, well, this trade pact is good for you, which of course became a very big issue in the UK during the Brexit debate. One of the things we found is that not all issues are equally polarized. So there are some issues that are just so far gone, and the sad thing is that climate change was the most polarized issue of all that we looked at. But when we asked people about climate change in the military context, so should the United States invest in technologies that would make the military less dependent on fossil fuels, much more willing to follow an expert cue. And that's interesting because it means that and that's different from the traditional framing of, are you for some kind of cap and trade system to mitigate climate change? That's the one that was much more polarized. So it's not a foregone conclusion that these issues become polarized, but it depends a lot on elite debate. And so take masks, right? Masks became a polarized issue, but that was not a foregone conclusion. Mm-hmm. And I read the 3,000-word New Yorker piece that on the backstory of the plague year, I think it was called. And there was a quote, I think it may have been an anonymous quote from a Trump advisor who said, to politicize masks was really not smart. So even people inside the Trump administration didn't think that was a good idea. The scary thing to me when we think about the survival of democracy is that this respect for democracy may be on its way to being polarized. And that would be a really dangerous situation if you had one party associated with respect for norms and democracy and another party that wasn't. And, I think it's a hard thing to stay nonpartisan in the classroom and in events like this. I've tried very hard in the Trump years to teach policy questions and in a way that makes clear that reasonable people can disagree, and Trump's positions reflect a segment of society that's very important, and we can't ignore them. His views on trade, widely shared by many, many Americans, right? But respect for democracy and democratic process and the rule of law is kind of in a different category. And I think if we get into partisan polarization on that issue, that's, we're in real trouble. And I don't know that we're really there yet fully, but it's not great, right? The direction isn't looking so great. So.
And you alluded to that before, and that's got to be one of the scariest things to me personally, is that, and we've always had extremes in this country. I mean, we've always had people on the extremes, and we've always had people who disrespected the rule of law and the concept of democracy and the concept of an independent judiciary. There's always been those groups. But it seems like technology is able to bring so many of these folks together, and they've been able to manifest themselves in ways that are fundamentally challenging. And I hope I'm not exaggerating, but when I say fundamentally challenging, in a way that they may have been in 1860. And so that's what's really is really concerning me here. Is there something in civics education that's not being done that could be done by schools throughout the country? Is that something? And I don't have enough granular knowledge to know what's actually happening. I mean, I was taught civics and U.S. history, and we had a thorough examination of all the sides on these things, but certainly came out with a clear commitment to the rule of law, independent judiciary, the efficacy of democracy. And I don't know if you know how that's happening now, or whether we're failing at teaching that.
I mean, I can only speak to my own kids, but they're still too young to really be at that stage. So, but I think when I try to think about how to teach these things, so, you know, I teach a course in American foreign policy, and I always start at the very beginning with Washington's farewell address, which was huge. I mean, the farewell address was principally about foreign policy. And I try to explain that in the class, we're going to bust a lot of myths. And one of the biggest ones that I try to bust is this idea that there was ever a bipartisan golden age of foreign policy. They were fighting bitter partisan battles over foreign policy and many other things, but I don't know about those things. I know about foreign policy, right? They were fighting these bitter partisan battles from the very beginning. So don't let anyone tell you that there was ever a time when politics stopped at the water's edge, right? You know that, but I think this is kind of a persistent myth. And when you hear people talk about unity today, I do think that we're conflating unity with agreement. So the test of whether you believe in democracy isn't that you can get everybody to agree. It's that you can get everybody to disagree and go home at the end of the day and come back tomorrow, right? And that's, it sounds really trite, but I think actually I mean, Joe Biden talks a lot about unity, but he may go do pandemic relief through reconciliation because that's politics, right? I mean, politics is not about just caving to the other side for the sake of unity. We are a very divided country, and we've gotten more polarized over time. But if we can't hold on to the basic respect for how we do business with each other, that's the really concerning thing. So I think maybe, and you know, one thing that's been hard parenting in the age of Trump, young children, is I've often wished my kids were younger or older, because if they were older, I could have these conversations with them. But if they were younger, they wouldn't be watching any of it. But they are old enough to get some of it by osmosis. And I think what's hard is this idea of he's the only president they really will know or have known up to this point. And I don't want them to think that all presidents of a single party or that I didn't vote for are bad, right? I mean, I think that's what's very difficult to explain, right? That this one doesn't respect the rule of law, or at least didn't at the end, but most of them do, and most transitions of power are not like this. And that's what I think we got to be careful that we don't have a generation of people who grows up thinking this is how we do business politically, right? Democratic politics, you resolve things without violence. That's sort of the basic thing that's on some basic level, that's what democracy means.
Absolutely. And I always think of, you were mentioning Washington, one of the most important things Washington did was go home to Mount Vernon after he was president, as representing the idea that we have peaceful transitions, peaceful transfer of power. This year, we did not have a peaceful transition of power. Nope. We did not have a peaceful transition of power. And that is something I'm still in the process of trying to process, because it was unheard of in our history, again, going back to the American Civil War, really. One thing you mentioned, you know, when we think of golden ages, I interned on Capitol Hill in 1977 when I was 2 years old. No, seriously, I interned on Capitol Hill in 1977. And these were the days when Jimmy Carter was president at the time. He was to be followed by Ronald Reagan. Howard Baker was the Republican leader in the Senate, and Robert Byrd was the Democratic leader in the Senate. And they disagreed. There were a lot of policy disagreements, but they did it in an amazing way. They did it with a lot of grace. They did it with collaboration. They were able to do some things in a bipartisan fashion, other things they weren't. But there was just a very different environment on Capitol Hill in those days than there is today. And a lot of people have pointed to what you mentioned, the polarization of the parties, the role of the media, the role of social media, and all these things. And people will ask me, when I do alumni talks in particular, are we ever going to get back to something like that? Now, of course, I don't think we ever get back to, but are we ever going to be able to reconstruct what you were suggesting, where we have our disagreements, but we do it in a way where there's a common understanding that we're all, if you will, patriots, we're all in it for the interest of the country as a whole?
So I wish I could say that there was sort of a, just send everybody to like the equivalent of political etiquette school, right? Right? Like,
Yeah.
if only we had better training in how to be a politician and get along with everybody, or there were more congressional dinner parties, you know, in the post-pandemic world, at least, that would make things better. But the article that I was reading this morning really drove this home for me. That just like businesses do things that will make them money, right? Politicians do things that will get them reelected. And you have to have incentives that point in the direction of preserving the system. And for decades, we did. And you mentioned Howard Baker, who did a lot of things to help Jimmy Carter in foreign policy, and which is not something you see anymore. And the
Panama Canal Treaty. If it weren't for Howard Baker, we'd have gotten the Panama Canal Treaty.
But it's not so much. I think it's not so much that the comedy of the Senate has declined. It's that the incentives to cooperate have evaporated, partly because of partisan polarization. And I think the scary thing is what that translated into today's problems. It's what you're seeing is a set of politicians who believe that incentives are pointing them towards not respecting democratic norms, or at least playing with fire, right? Like pretending enough for the sake of a shrinking demographic that is very powerful within one party. A lot of this has to do with demographic change, I think, also, right? But the politicians who are trying to kind of capitalize on this, for them, the incentives are to play with this fire because the benefits they think are worth it. And that's very dangerous, right? I mean, you need to have a system in which nobody has any incentive to disrespect elections that are clearly, certified 3 times and that sort of thing. We came through the 2000 election, but can you imagine if we had, and I think a lot of people, that was the scenario they worried about, and they were quite relieved that it seemed like it was pretty clear in 2020, but we still had this happen. So I think, the cold-eyed realist in me, in every sense of the term realist, just thinks until everybody once again believes it's politically beneficial to them to respect these norms right out of the gate. I mean, I don't think belatedly counts, right? Then I don't think we're gonna fix this until that's the case.
And that's a scary, troubling thought.
And the good thing is, it was heartening to see Senator Cassidy yesterday say, look, I was persuaded by the House. Now, this was on the very narrow question of whether this is constitutional and so forth. But, some, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because my memories of that day are somewhat blurry. But I think one of the senators recanted who originally was planning to challenge the results, and then were interrupted, came back and said, and I can't remember, it may have been James Langford, but I couldn't swear.
I can't remember, but that's correct. After the insurrection,
there was at least one who had gone on the record saying he was going to challenge the results, and then after the riot said no. And I think said he was not. He said, I'm not going to challenge the results. And I think Kelly Loeffler was the same, the outgoing senator from Georgia. But the names are less important. That there were people who reacted to this in real time and recognized that they were playing with fire. It's important that politicians take ownership of their mistakes and correct them. Just like Anthony Fauci got the mask issue wrong and then said, okay, I was wrong. Those are important steps, and we have to welcome that and embrace that, and not be too purist about who we, politicians make mistakes, and it's important that the ones who try to correct them get credit for it.
I agree. Absolutely. Professors make mistakes too. We always
Yes,
try to come back and say
all the time.
all the time is right. So Kirsten Maher and Patty De La Puente ask a question slightly differently, but it raises the issue of third parties. We've had a two-party system pretty much since we started having a party system, and there's some smaller third parties we've had. But unlike, say, a European system where that's much more common to have multiple parties, do you think that could help in any which way?
So I'm going to cop out here and this is a great question, but I'm going to tell you that the better answer to this than I ever could give is probably in Tom Edsall's column in the New York Times today, which quotes extensively from a whole lot of very smart political scientists on should the United States move to a PR system or a different electoral system. And the first half of the column is basically a whole bunch of them saying, if we did this, it would fix things. And the second half is a whole bunch of other primarily American politics scholars who say, yes, that's true, but we're never going to do it because there's no political will to just give up power, right? Getting politicians to give up power turns out to be the hardest trick and the most important trick in politics, I think. And there's just who benefits from that, right? Certainly not the people who are currently playing with fire, right? So I think this longing for the Mitt Romney party, if you will, like the center right party, is enormous, but the problem is the longing for it is primarily from the shrinking number of people who occupy that political space and everybody to the left of it, right? The center left longs for that. But the distribution of views in the country is much more polarized. So I just don't see who that third party is going to represent that would fix the problem.
That makes sense.
I'm a foreign policy scholar, so I go read the column and ask those people.
So let me ask you another question that is not a foreign policy question, but
as long as it's not physics.
I will not ask you. So I could get into quantum entanglement because I still can't understand that, but I'm not going to ask that question. Here's an interesting question. So how do we, the polarization exists in the country, and there are many different ways in which it expresses itself, urban, rural, white, non-white, all kinds of different ways it expresses itself. One suggestion that has been proposed, and recently Fareed Zakaria proposed it, it's been something I've been thinking about for a while, would be some kind of national service requirement for all citizens beginning at, say, the age of 18, and they would do it for a year or two before college. It would be analogous to, so my father, for instance, after college, my father was drafted. This was before I was born. He went with my mother, they lived in Germany. And one of the things my father always said is it exposed him to people from parts of the country where he hadn't been. It exposed him to people from all different socioeconomic levels, all different educational backgrounds, and that was a very positive learning experience. And so recently, Fareed, but as I said, others have proposed something similar where maybe you go into the public health service, maybe you go into the National Forest Service, maybe you do some kind of other service activity, or maybe you do go in to the military, but that it would be required of everyone, men, women, no distinctions would be drawn there, and that you would do it before college with the view that, if I grew up in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, maybe I would find myself in Nebraska or in, I don't know, North Dakota or someplace very different from where I've grown up, and it would expose me to a different set of people with different views. lead me to understand and to be able to respect those views?
So I'll go back to Washington because one of the things that I assign alongside Washington's farewell address is a chapter from Joseph Ellis's Founding Brothers, which is a great read. And the chapter on the farewell address gets into this whole question of who drafted it and all those things, which he decides is very silly debate. But it turns up a very interesting fact, which is that Washington really wanted there to be a long section of the farewell address about a national university in the new capital, Washington, that became Washington. And it was precisely for the reasons that you are talking about. And remember, this is at a time when America's not a done deal. This whole idea, can the North and the South and the various states really live together with such different interests and geographic characteristics and therefore population characteristics and slavery and not slavery and so forth. And Hamilton thought this was just an odd fit and basically insisted that it be axed. But this is basically the missing section of the farewell address. And if you go back and you read it, there is this 2-line, it doesn't fit. Washington insisted that a couple lines stay in. And it's basically, in this young time of life, you go to this university and you mix with people from different places. But if you read it in context, it's totally out of place. And I started teaching, I spent 10 years across town at George Washington University, and GW was actually founded to fulfill that goal, not until like 1821. But that's my way of saying Washington agreed with you that would help a lot, whether it was through an educational institution or national service. And I think we're constantly struggling with what is the way of maintaining an American identity and national cohesion. The thing that worries me a little, and maybe it's just because I taught civil military relations in my national security class last night, but there's a lot of debate in this country right now over whether we have too much trust in the military or we turn to the military too often. And that is the one institution that fits this description. It's no longer required, just, we have an all volunteer force now. But it's not clear. I think the jury's still out as to whether exposure to lots of different views reinforces your own or makes you more tolerant of different views. And it may be that not everybody reacts to it the same way. On top of that, this whole notion of excessive deference to the military is, a lot of people in the military think that's a problem. So I guess I would want to be convinced that this is really going to generate cohesion rather than certain types of people go to the military, certain types of people go into the public health service, and it just reinforces the existing divisions that we have.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point, because when my father was drafted in the 50s, there wasn't a choice. I mean,
right.
The only thing, because he was a college grad, they said to him, if you want to go to officer candidate school, you can do that. And he said, no, I'm happy to serve as an enlisted person. I'll do my 2-year and then whatever the reserve commitment was. But there wasn't a choice of, you could work in the National Park Service in Yellowstone or something along those lines. So there may very well be a self-selection. I guess the one way to perhaps address that would be, if you went into the military, your service would be shorter than if you went into something else. But that's even not going to guarantee.
Yeah, I mean, but how do you design the system? How would you get? I mean, there's all, as you nicely pointed out, right? There's always been extremists. There's always, and as I said, there's always been partisanship. There's always been people gaming systems, right? People getting draft exemptions they shouldn't have, and so forth. But designing a system that, on average, is a leveler and is fair it's very hard proposition. And who would you put in charge of designing it? I mean, even that would be politically fraught. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I just think how you get from here to there in a way that doesn't just deepen divisions is not a trivial problem.
No, it's definitely not. And
sorry, I'm coming across as kind of a downer today.
No, well, there's another way to do it, and that would be for academic institutions to say, we will not admit anyone at the undergraduate level unless they've had some kind of service. And then you start to create an environment like that. where those opportunities would then emerge.
As long as you could have enough financial aid that you
would have to, you'd have to be able to do that. Carrie Dooley raises a question, which is another interesting one, connect to academic institutions, and she says, isn't it possible the incentives in academia are still incredibly focused on winning an argument, focusing on evidence that supports one argument over full discourse? Doesn't this create a mindset that manifests itself in the way politics are geared toward an adversarial stance? I thought that was that's an interesting question.
Yes, that is an interesting question. Although I don't know, so it is an interesting question, but I don't know how we would implement, say, in the classroom, the other way. What's the alternative, right? I mean, I like to ask my students to take positions that may not, I always tell my students, I'm never going to judge you on the positions that you articulate in class. And I will sometimes force you to take a position, like I'll assign you a position in a debate, because I want you to be able to see both sides of, I mean, we only study the topics that are hard and interesting and don't have an obvious right answer in my class. I always tell them, like, we're not going to have a debate over whether we should maintain good relations with the UK, right? Like, what's the other side of that argument? There was another side to that argument back in Washington's day, but no more, right? How we should handle the Iran, that's a really hard question. And I always tell them, you know, I'm not gonna, if I assign you an argument to be on the side of we should bomb Iran, I'm not gonna assume you're a warmonger. You're just doing your job articulating that position. And if you were in the State Department arguing passionately or prepping your boss to argue passionately in the Situation Room for a return to the Iran deal, you better be prepared to counter the argument that surely someone's going to make, that no, we need to hit them, or no, we need to threaten to hit them. So if you can't anticipate both sides of an argument where it's reasonable to have two sides, or where reasonable people can disagree, then I don't know that we'd be doing our jobs. So I think it's a really interesting and important point, but I'm not sure what the alternative would be.
Well, and one's not saying in teaching that way that one view is right or wrong. As a matter of fact, that's why you're teaching it that way. And hopefully in doing it, you show that in certain cases, arguments can be mustered on either side. But the fact that they can be mustered on either side means you need a little bit of humility when you approach what the other side is. I mean, do the same in international law. I force my students to write legal memos where they have to argue that this action is lawful or this action is unlawful. Now, I don't have them do it on something like, you know, can you shoot a diplomat? No, there's not a debate on that.
Yeah.
But can you engage in the use of military force to stop a genocide? Legally, there's a debate on that. And so you get students to explore that.
I always tell them they can't get an A on a paper in my class if they don't address counter arguments.
Absolutely.
But I'm also not going to ask them a question. I mean, why would I want to grade 25 papers on whether we should have good relations with the UK in 2020? Like, that's not an interesting question. It has no good counter arguments.
Exactly. So. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask you this question. The monkey cage. Tell us about the monkey cage. Everybody should read the monkey cage, but tell us how it got its name, and tell us some of the highlights.
So the monkey cage got its name from a quote from H.L. Mencken. Democracy is the art of running the circus from the monkey cage. I think that the founders, of whom I'm not one, but many of my former colleagues at GW are, wish they'd chosen a different name. We may be changing the name, but it's a bunch of political scientists, of whom I'm one. Georgetown's Eric Booten used to be one. We all have different beats, so I do the foreign policy. For a long time, I called it the "Are we going to have a nuclear war this week?" beat during the North Korea scare, the Iran scare. We have a bunch of people who do American elections, and we have Sarah Binder who does Congress. We have Jessica Weiss who covers China and East Asia. And basically, we publish pieces that appear in the Washington Post online. So you can find it under the politics section of the Washington Post. But we use political science research to explain the news. So these are purely explainer pieces. There's something that happened in the news. What political science research do we have that's relevant to this? A lot of times we're debunking myths. Sometimes it's 5 things you need to know about such and such a topic. We don't do policy prescriptions. We don't do policy recommendations or implications. It's not op-ed. People often say these are op-eds, but there's no opinion that, or other than, you know, as you say, like when things are obviously against the law, we would say so and so forth. But when there's debatable opinion, we try to show that there's a debate and what the evidence is and let readers decide for themselves. But we usually publish 4 or 5 pieces a day, but that's on all topics. So I might have 4 or 5 pieces that I edit a week, and I write for them when there's something relevant. I did an explainer the day after the riots, or 2 days after the riots, when Nancy Pelosi pointed out or said she called up the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, and said, I wanted to make sure that there are safeguards in place since Trump still has sole nuclear launch authority. There's no such thing as safeguards against the president launching nuclear weapons. And Nancy Pelosi surely knew that, having been on the Intelligence Committee and been speaker twice. But I think she was trying to point out politically the stakes of this. And so I did a quick interview Q&A that we published in written form with Vipin Narang at MIT, an expert on nuclear weapons and nuclear policy. And we put it up almost immediately as sort of a, no, there's nothing you can do to stop President Trump from issuing an order to launch nuclear weapons. And here's what Nancy Pelosi was probably trying to do. So we try to stay current and really use political science research to explain the news. And we also have now topic guides that give guides to all of our past coverage on different topics. And Georgetown SFS students have been instrumental in helping me generate those topic guides. So thank you to the Georgetown Dean's Office for giving us a lot of funding to do that last summer.
Well, Hoya Saxa. And Professor Saunders, we thank you for a fascinating conversation. I think we're all going to be looking to see how America survives. I believe it will, but we're going to be looking at how American democracy survives. And thank you for your great insights. Please check out the blog. Please check out the Monkey Cage. It is fantastic. Very, very good work by distinguished political scientists there. Let me thank the Georgetown University Alumni Association for sponsoring this webinar. Special shout out to Kelly Young, who is the impresaria, absolutely astounding, who put things together, and to Eleanor Monty Jones, whose idea SFS Online and On Topic was. So thank you. We'll be seeing you in a few weeks.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are honored, Elizabeth. Thank you. And thanks to all our great visitors.